This is from Genesis chapter 37. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while all your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Last week we studied the story of Abraham and Sarah and found a crystal clear answer to anybody who has looked at themselves and wondered, can God use me? We got our answer to that. Can God do something amazing even with me? The answer is yes. And today's story is for anyone who's ever had a moment where you wondered if God was still working. If you had a moment where you just thought, God, are you still there? Are you still with me? Are we still a thing? If that's you, this is your day. This is the lesson for all of us who have had life rock us back on our heels and found ourselves thinking, hold on, this was not part of the plan. Anybody ever had a plan? How many people here, if you're visiting with us, I ask questions and nobody ever raises their hand. Have you ever made a 5-year plan? Like you just laid out? I know we have some, like planner was part of their job description. So I know some of you you make this plan and you think, I'm going to finish school on this schedule. I'm going to find that special person and get married on this schedule. I'm going to have kids on this schedule. We make financial plans. We make career plans, weight loss plans. Be honest now, how many of you had a specific plan for the timetable when you would have children? They're so cooperative. Always right on time, aren't they? It's great stuff. As we move through the story, you see very clearly, I think we as humans, we sense this, but here's your clear proof. There's God's plan, and then there's all of our plans. And these two don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. They can be entirely separate, and sometimes you felt that, I'm sure. Adam and Eve decided they liked their plan better than God's plan. Abram and Sarai decided God was moving a little too slowly, decided to help him out. Do you think Joseph, at the tender age of 17, had a plan for his life? I don't know. We don't know much about him. We spent most of Sunday school in my class just talking about, do we need to revisit the whole idea of Joseph? It's hard to say. Maybe he thought about the future. I doubt he anticipated what was about to happen. There's no way he could have anticipated the crazy twists and turns coming up in his life. There's one thing I do think he could have anticipated. I think if he had been paying a little more attention, he would have known his brothers were going to hurt him. Have you ever watched one kid antagonize another? And usually they do it on purpose, knowing they're going to get a response. But, you have to think, Joseph couldn't have been so stupid to think nothing was going to happen. But if he had any character flaws, and it's hard to tell how much of this was how his brothers perceived him and how much was him, but he definitely, if he had been paying attention, he would have known that he was setting himself up for some trouble. So just a real quick catch-up, since not everybody has been together the entire time. So we have Abraham and Sarah who are called to be the core of God's new plan to reach humanity. They're going to be the father and mother of a nation. And so they have a child named Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. They have two sons, Jacob and Esau. And Rebekah favored Jacob, and Dad favored Esau, set up all kinds of bad stuff. Stories for another day. But Rebekah comes up with this great plan to move God's plan along. It's a classic story. Causes this huge rift in the family. Jacob has to leave town so his brother doesn't kill him. He has all these adventures. Finally comes home, and God renames him Israel and says, "You're going to be the father of my nation." He has two wives. He also had children by their handmaids. They used the Abraham and Sarah method. And so there's a load of brothers. And the youngest is Joseph. Not just the baby, but the favorite. And so it appears that sometimes he did work, but sometimes he didn't, because there's also a story where his dad sends him to check on his brothers. So maybe he helped, maybe he didn't. When he was there, apparently at least once, he was like, "They were just goofing off the whole time anyway, Dad." Which may have been malicious, may have been the truth. We don't know. But being tattled on, snitches get stitches. That's what they say. That was the saying in my preschool. And so, if he was a typical little brother, and we don't know that he was. Some of this we're injecting our own experiences and human nature into it. But, if he was a typical little brother, then he sat in the shade and slurped his lemonade really loudly and would be like, "Boy, it looks hot out there, guys." He probably did. I'm just saying, that's a little brother move right there. We don't know if he did, but and they sweated it out. And so Dad clearly favors him, maybe doesn't work him as hard, gets him a special outfit. So lesson number one, we always try to have nice applied life lessons. Don't play favorites. Especially, period. But among your children, it's basically a guarantee of trouble. Don't do that. There, good. You learned it here first. So there's already tension. You notice it doesn't say they hated him because he was a jerk, or they hated him because that's what big brothers do with little brothers. They hated him because he was the favorite, because of Dad's choices. Did you catch that? And then he has this dream. And he decided he needed to share that with his brothers. Tactical error, at the very least. That made them even angrier. And so that kind of may have been the breaking point. So lesson number 2, if you have dreams about your family bowing down to you, just don't say anything. Some things are better kept to yourself, okay? See, you can walk out of here, you learn 2 really important life lessons, even if the rest doesn't make any sense. So, you can just see, you can picture, these guys are a few years older, they're doing all the work, and you can see him telling this story, and their knuckles are turning white around their shepherd's staves, gritting their teeth a little bit. You can just picture this as he's going on about them all bowing down. And then we have almost a flashback to the Cain and Abel dynamic, and they're like, we're getting rid of this guy. We're out here in the middle of nowhere. Nobody will ever know. By the way, I knew a guy from Dothan, Alabama, which was clearly named after this obscure verse in 37:17. Let's go to Dothan. So there's really a place in Alabama named Dothan. So he comes walking up, and they grab him, and they threw him in a cistern. It's kind of like a storage area, but you could just loosely call it a pit. And it appears, I'm trying to crunch a whole bunch of stuff without going over it blow by blow. Reuben, the eldest, seems like he's trying to angle on, letting the guys blow off some steam and then getting Joseph back to his dad. So they throw him in the cistern, and Reuben's planning on coming back later and rescuing him and taking him home and just be like, just don't say anything, everything's fine. No blood, no foul, right? But then this caravan pulls up. And this was something that we noticed in Sunday school. They were Ishmaelites. How interesting. Relatives. The Ishmaelites came by. They were on their way to Egypt. And one of the brothers was like, this is perfect. If we actually killed him, we might feel bad about it. So let's just sell him, and then we'll have money, no blood on our hands. It's a win-win. So that's a rough interpretation. And they go for it. So they sell him, and so here's Joseph. Mere hours ago, he was the favored child with his awesome coat, just going to make sure his older brothers were doing their job correctly. And all of a sudden, he's in a caravan heading to Egypt, about to be sold as a slave. That's a turn of events, to be sure, isn't it? That would make you say, God, I don't remember this in the 5-year plan. Are you still there? Who knows what all thoughts ran through his mind as they loped across the desert, maybe on the back of a donkey, maybe being dragged by one. We don't know. But here's what's amazing. The boys take, the many-colored coat. They dip it in blood. And they take it back to their dad. It's one thing. It sounds really terrible saying it out loud. It's one thing to kill your brother. Get rid of your brother. That was a awful, awful thing to do. But think about what they did to their dad. They go home and they're like, eaten by a lion, something, I don't know, we just found this blood-soaked coat. Have you ever thought about what they did to their dad? But how could these guys have known? This is the part that is really mind-blowing, that really just makes us have to step back and think for a minute. These guys, even as they were working out a plot to destroy their brother and devastate their father, and God was using those terrible decisions to work out his plan. How amazing is that? Remember, if you're not following the whole story through, this part's easy to forget. God had already told Abraham, generations ago, that his people would be slaves in Egypt. This was all in the works. I can't even fully make sense of all that, but it was all in the works. It was in the script. Now, I don't want any of you to go home and beat somebody up and say, I think that was part of God's plan. Don't do that. But even dumb choices, even terrible choices, God can use to make his story move forward. That's just, I'm getting pretty close to speechless here. Close. And so check this out. Here's Joseph. I mean, really, and unfortunately, this is a reality for millions of people in our world today. One day being a perfectly normal person with a normal life, and the next day being in slavery. This is real. But just try to picture, you're sitting back and your biggest worry is, I finished my show on Netflix. What do I binge on next? And the next thing, someone owns you and you have no rights. Just try to wrap your mind around that. Chapter 39 of Genesis. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who is one of Pharaoh's officials, that's important. He's very important to Pharaoh's system. The captain of the guard bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. That's a really weird sentence, given that he was just sold into slavery by his brothers. Maybe it's just me. It could be just me because I am different. That really jarred me as I'm reading. I'm like, what a weird thing to say. when the world has just turned upside down and it's about as bad as it can get, the Lord was with him. What? What? This doesn't sound like prospering. But we need to keep in mind that God was helping him make the best of the situation he was already in. He prospered in that setting because of God's hand upon him. Now it does seem, even if perhaps Joseph was really tone deaf with regards to his older brothers, I think, based on what we see and don't see, that he was very tuned into God. We don't see any hint of him moping. Can you imagine a 17-year-old who has been wronged? Not saying a word about it? Yeah, that's hard, isn't it? When we're younger, we tend to be very vocal about the wrongs in the world and how they pertain to us and unfairness, don't we? But he didn't complain. He didn't spend a whole lot of time moping. Apparently, he just got to work and quickly became so important and indispensable that Potiphar put him in charge of all kinds of stuff. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, now an Egyptian who didn't believe in God saw the Lord was with him, that's pretty important. And that the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, entrusted to his care everything he owned. This is the guy he bought. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, so on and so on. Boy, that really jumped out at me. You remember what Abram and Sarah were called to do by God? The original deal? To be a blessing. And this is the first time that I've seen clear evidence where someone from that family was literally a blessing to someone they weren't related to. How about that? That seems like making the best of a really rotten situation, doesn't it? But, well, the story had some more twists and turns, right? Potiphar's wife lies about him, makes a false accusation. Potiphar believes her. He goes right into the dungeon. Now, because Potiphar was one of Pharaoh's officials, he went into the special dungeon for people in trouble with the Pharaoh. That's important to the story. This time, surely we could indulge him giving into some despair and thinking, for goodness sake, I worked my way out of a terrible situation. I was running the household. Things were looking good. And now, through no fault of my own, just because I had integrity and refused to give in to temptation, now I'm in a dungeon. None of that. Keeps his head up, does the right things, and once again. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Oh, while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. So again, this woman did him wrong. It was a terrible thing to do, but God was with him. So sometimes we tend to think because things are going wrong that God has abandoned us, that those two things can't go together, that God's favor and presence and circumstance are somehow linked, and that if things go badly, then clearly God must not be there. That is not true. What we see is that God is at work throughout this. And because Joseph stuck with God, God was able to make amazing things happen. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness, granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those he held in prison. He was responsible for running the whole place. And the warden went and watched Netflix. I don't know what he did. That's a little unusual, perhaps. Fair? I mean, I know it wouldn't happen now for sure. But then, goodness. The Lord was with him. And so even though it may look, if you look at it only through through human eyes, the lower part of the story, you see this guy just being wronged over and over again. But if we keep the view of God's upper story, his narrative, things are running right the way they're supposed to be. All the pieces are clicking into place. Because there in that dungeon are other people who work for the Pharaoh. And he starts, at his, it's hard to tell exactly how old he is, but we'll say well into his 20s, he develops this new gift. He's able to interpret dreams. I think that's kind of neat, since this all started with him having dreams. And I wonder if he interpreted his own, or if he didn't even think about it at the time. But these people would, they had nothing to do but sit and talk. They would tell about these dreams they had, and Joseph would say, oh, well, here's what it means. And so he made these connections with people who worked for Pharaoh. And one of them, in fact, was released from the prison. And Joseph may have thought, hey, this is good. I made good friends with a guy who has Pharaoh's ear. He sees him every day. Surely he'll say something about me. And he was freed and promptly forgot all about Joseph. There's a non-twist for you. Two years after he plants those seeds and makes those connections, Pharaoh has a dream, and this guy is like, you know what? I just remembered, there's a guy in your dungeon who knows how to interpret dreams. And so they, call, hey, clean that guy up and bring him upstairs. This is chapter 41. And, he had already tried all of his wise men. Nobody knew how to do this. So he calls Joseph up, and he's like, okay, you're the man, right? You're supposed to be able to do this. And so Pharaoh sent for Joseph. He was brought from the dungeon, shaved, changed clothes. That's good. And Pharaoh said, I have a dream, and no one can interpret. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph's answer is really interesting. He says, I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I love that. He had a reputation. He had a skill, apparently. But he knew it wasn't him. He knew he was just the conduit. He knew he was just the pass-through. He knew it wasn't his skill. This was God's interpretation coming through him. So I love that he says, well, I can't, but God can. And I'd just like to say, may we, every one of us, whatever we do in every situation, follow Joseph on this, and making sure that God gets every credit for everything that we do. Even if it's something that we do outside of church. Who gave us the abilities that we use in our careers or on the golf course? Are they ours? I think they're God's. So I really like the whole idea. Not I, but Christ who lives within me. We don't accomplish anything meaningful in this world by our own strength and skills and smarts, though we have lots of all those things, and we're above average in looks too. But we want people to be touched by our efforts and see God, not us. We want them to see right through and look at Urbanna Baptist Church and say, there's God at work. That's what we want. Okay. So, Joseph hears the dream, and sure enough, God tells him exactly what it means. Okay, there's going to be 7 years of plentiful harvests, and then 7 years of famine. And then we see this really neat picture of everything Joseph has learned through all these years of running a household and then running a jail. He starts ticking off. Okay, here's what you need to do. I can see it. You got to do this, this, this. You need a guy with these qualifications. Make sure you ask him if he knows this and this. Find somebody who can do all these things. And it appears he was like, I'll just head back to my job down in the prison. And Pharaoh shows how smart he is. He's like, you're the guy. You're the guy you're describing. So he has gone from slave to running a household, to prisoner to running a prison, and now he's running Egypt. How's that for a roller coaster? He was sold by his brothers at 17, and after 13 years of some really hard knocks and hard lessons, he was ready to save the world at the age of 30. And Abraham and Sarah paused from their worship around the throne of God and said, seriously, 30? We had age spots that were 30 years old when we started. But anyway, they had to be like, this is not fair. Only 30. So at 30, he takes over. He implements his plan. He's gathering up just massive amounts of food. Fast forward 9 years. So the 7 years of plenty are over. We're 2 years into the famine. Now things are getting serious. People are starving all across the ancient world. And Joseph's the one with food. So everyone is coming in front of him and throwing themselves at his mercy, and he's selling them food. Over time, he basically, on Pharaoh's behalf, bought up every animal and every piece of land that existed because people had to come to him for food. That's a side thing. But that's not a side thing. Joseph made Pharaoh the massively powerful person that was the one that said, I will not let your people go. I'm just saying. Why was he so powerful and so, okay. Because Joseph bought up everything in his name. And then Joseph's brothers walk in. Everyone was starving. And so these guys had made the trek to Egypt. 22 years after they sold their little brother to some traders. They walk in and bow down to the guy who has the only food in the world. And somewhere in there, Joseph remembered his dream. And again, we spent a few minutes in our Sunday school class just trying to imagine that moment when he realized that God had everything lined up from the time he was 17. God saw this coming and had positioned him for this. Unbelievable. And on the human level, in the lower story, we would wonder, what does a little brother do once his hated older brothers are now in his hands? He can point to a guard and they'll stab him on the spot. What, Egyptians could kill anybody they wanted to. Just a word. He could have sent them away and let them starve nice and slow. But he surprises the reader, and he surprised his brothers, that's for sure. Because he responded with love and forgiveness. And there's some back and forth stuff. I'm telling you, if you've read this, I can remember reading this more than once as a younger man and just thinking, what was all that? Was he just messing with them? Joseph needed to know in his heart that these guys were not the same people that sold him off, who were willing to do that to their dad just to get rid of a younger brother. And so he maneuvered everything to see what they would do when the new youngest, Benjamin, was in danger, how they would respond when their father's heart was on the verge of breaking over another loss. And they came through. In fact, Judah, he was the ringleader for this whole, let's sell him into slavery. It's cleaner that way. Judah was the one who said, take my life instead of his. My father can't handle that. And that's when Joseph was like, okay. Now I see. That's what he needed to know. He needed to see that they had grown, that they had learned, that there had been some change from the time he was young. And he saw what he needed to see, and he revealed himself. He burst into tears. And then he tells us and them why he was able to resist revenge, why he was able to be joyful and tearful and have a reunion. It's because he got a glimpse of God's story. He was able to see what God had been doing all this time. That's a gift. We get little glimpses every now and then, but Joseph was able to see that everything that had happened to him had been to position him, not just to save thousands of lives in the area of Egypt and the ancient world, but to preserve the future nation of Israel. Without him in that position right then, those brothers and their dad starved to death. But he was able to bring them all to Egypt, give them the best of the land. He maneuvered them, this really great area that was nice and fertile. And so 66 people, the brothers, their wives, all of their kids, move into the area of Goshen. And he makes sure they're cared for. And that's the kernel that grows into a nation. And in fact, before listen to me, before Jacob makes that trip to Egypt, God speaks to him. He says, Egypt is where I turn this family into a nation. It was all in the plan. It was all laid out. And Joseph saw that. I'm your brother Joseph that you sold into Egypt. Don't even be angry with yourselves, because what you meant for evil, God meant for good. It was to save lives that God sent me. It's a big difference from you sold me up the river, isn't it? God sent me. He saw the story. He saw how God had made, even through some really devastating choices that people made that were sinful choices, that he put Joseph in just the right position. So really, and I couldn't even find a fancier way to see this, but God uses us. We know that for certain, but he can even use our weaknesses, even our mistakes, to make his plan pay out. Now, that didn't stop the brothers. I mean, there were still consequences, right? They spent 22 years regretting what they'd done. 22 years knowing what they'd done to their dad, knowing what they'd done to their brother. There's still consequences, but God's plan and God's story persist. And he even uses those things. So, thinking from Joseph's perspective, how much suffering is it worth to be in position to save people, to save my own family? It was worth it. How much suffering and struggling is it worth for us to be prepared to do what God has in mind for us? And this truly is a story that reminds us that Romans 8:28 is something we can take to the bank. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Now notice, you have to take the whole sentence. He's not just trying to make everything be good. That's not the right interpretation. He's going to work things towards good, even the bad stuff, as long as we are sticking with him and as long as we are pursuing our calling in his kingdom. And if we can take care of that, we can't control the story. Some of you have tried this. We can't make other people do what we want them to do. We can't make the world be like we want the world to be. But we can love God with all our hearts, and we can be fully devoted to his calling. And then we can let him take care of the rest. That sounds like a good deal. And so this is a promise that I think we should really claim and really live by. Our hymn of commitment today is to take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. We're going to stand and sing hymn number 283 together. Look, we have new members joining the church. I think Alan and Diane just wanted to speak to you guys briefly. This is their last Sunday with us. We celebrated some this morning at Sunday school, but they just wanted an opportunity to say some last words before they start on their next adventure in South Carolina.
I think it's kind of ironic you mentioned Joseph at 17 having a plan. At 77, we don't have a plan. But we are doing what we think God has asked us to do. But what we want to say here is we thank all of you. I mean, as some of you heard this in the breakfast this morning. We have learned over the 15 years that we've been here how to grow as a Christian from all of you. And we thank you for that. And our challenge is that we're going to be down there spreading the news and the good word and the gospel. And we know that you will continue to do it here. And I just want to stay in touch. Michelle's going to keep us in touch. And we're going to keep learning of all the great things that Urbanna Baptist Church, that Pastor Bruce is going to be doing. Again, we just thank you for all the time that the 15 years that we've enjoyed our Christian lives here.
Well, you have helped us grow in our faith, and we appreciate that. And thank you for embracing us and loving us. Thank you.
Well, that wasn't hard at all, was it? I'm going to ask them to hang out up here at the front, so if you'd like to come by and say something, give them a hug. I hope you'll do that. Let's, well, I had this whole great speech ready to close the sermon, and now, so be like Joseph and try to glimpse God's call. Let's close with a blessing for our friends as they start their new journey, okay? Lord, we call upon you to just accompany the McNamees as they go into a new place with new people. And Lord, use their hearts and their humor and their warmth to connect and to help people get to know you. We ask you to bless their travels, their moving, all the things about their new house, new doctors, new everything. Lord, we know that you will use them in powerful ways to spread your word and to spread your love. And so, Lord, just help them to always carry a little bit of us with them, and vice versa, as we will always appreciate the contribution they have been to the family and to the body here. And may we all travel under your blessing always, in the name of Christ.